different angle. He has read all the right books, but he has got the wrong thing out of every one. How can he be so nearly right and yet invariably just not right? When you set out to correct his heresies, you find that he, forsooth, has decided to correct yours. Lewis describes this interaction with Barfield as the Great War. He lays it out in Surprised by Joy. And Barfield helped Lewis to abandon his materialism. He didn't convert to Christianity at that point, but he adopted a theistic perspective. He also got Lewis to abandon his chronological snobbery, the idea that everything inevitably progresses. Lewis bolted against that idea after meeting Barfield. But Barfield was not just an influence on Lewis. He was actually one of the original members of the Inklings. Humphrey Carpenter has pointed out that Barfield joined the Inklings even before Charles Williams did. As a matter of fact, the Inklings were probably a group of writers who, for whom conflict was an important part of their friendship. They didn't all share the same doctrines, but they definitely shared the same outlook. They saw God everywhere. Now, how they saw God everywhere was very different. Tolkien actually was firsthand witness to the tension between Barfield and Lewis. He writes in a letter to Christopher, he says this: "A great evening, an evening Inklings," and he writes that C.S. Lewis was highly flown. He was pretentious, right? But he says about Barfield, "Owen Barfield is the only man who can tackle C.S. Lewis, making him define everything and interrupting his most dogmatic pronouncements with subtle distinctions." Basically, Barfield was calling Lewis out, making him clarify his ideas. Tolkien writes that later on in the evening, Barfield shared a short play on Jason and Medea, so Barfield had this creative streak in him as well. And he concludes the letter to his son by saying, "The result was a most amusing and highly contentious evening, on which, had an outsider eavesdropped, he would have thought it a meeting of fell enemies hurling deadly insults before drawing their guns." As a matter of fact, Barfield had written a children's book called The Silver Trumpet, and it was a popular book in the Tolkien household. That book and Barfield's discussion on language influenced Tolkien. As a matter of fact, in The Hobbit, Tolkien describes the only philological moment in The Hobbit as being influenced by Barfield. He says, this is when Bilbo is walking down to face the dragon Smaug in chapter 12. "To say that Bilbo's breath was taken away is no description at all. There are no words left to express his staggerment, since men changed the language they learned of elves in the days when all the world was wonderful." Tolkien recognized the importance of language fragmenting. As a matter of fact, if anybody's interested in reading the extent to which Barfield influenced Tolkien, there's a book called Splintered Light by Verlin Flieger that I think might interest you. Barfield saw language, metaphor, and reality as inextricably linked together. And the moment you started stripping that away, you started stripping metaphor away from reality, you actually create more confusion than you make more sense, a kind of reliving of the Babel moment. Barfield also seems to have been able to use his language to speak, I think, honestly about Lewis. After Lewis's death, Tolkien actually said that Barfield was probably closest to describing Lewis's character. Barfield asked the question, was there something, at least in his speaking of Lewis, in his impressive, indeed splendid literary personality, which was somehow, and with no taint of insincerity, voulé, contrived, or deliberate? Barfield was comfortable using his language to speak truth, but also to build up people, to use life in his words. He says about Lewis that Lewis was a distinct combination of an almost supreme intellectual and fantastic maturity, laced with moral energy on the one hand, but with a certain psychic or spiritual immaturity on the other. Barfield, I think, I have encountered his ideas probably most profoundly in his discarded image. I use that in my medieval literature course. And Lewis talks about saving appearances, a direct influence of Barfield. Barfield's book, Saving Appearances, is an important work. Barfield's words in poetic diction, we can hear them echoed in the discarded image, but I want to read them from poetic diction. I want to read Barfield's words. Science deals with the world which it perceives, but seeking more and more to penetrate the veil of naive perceptions, progresses only toward the goal of nothing, because it still does not accept in practice, whatever it may admit theoretically, that the mind first creates what it perceives as objects, including the instruments which science uses for that very penetration. The rest is imagination. Only by imagination, therefore, can the world be known. And what is needed is not only that larger and larger telescopes should be constructed, but that the human mind should become increasingly aware of its own creative activity. That power of creation in language was Barfield's unique contribution to the long-standing legacy of the Inklings.
Elam's remarks lead well into what I'm about to share. My task is to help us understand how this man actually thought. And some of the things that he shared on Lewis, and particularly overcoming materialism and this idea of chronological snobbery, which he said, which is this sort of idea that things are progressing now and in the past is sort of old and we shouldn't have anything to do with that. Also the idea that metaphor is in a sense more real than prosaic language, and also the creativity of the imagination in the human mind. So hopefully by the time I'm done we have a deeper understanding. It's amazing how these things sort of fit together. We've not even discussed what we're going to speak about. So I'm going to be reading since that's the only way I do things. So bear with me. Owen Barfield's work stretches across disciplines. He wrote on linguistics, science, psychoanalysis, sociology, literature, philosophy, and theology, to name a few. His thought comes to us in multiple forms. He was a writer of both fiction and nonfiction. He speaks to us through both poetry and prose, although he'd prefer the former. He developed formidable theories regarding the history of human consciousness, the origin of language, and the veracity of poetic utterance, aesthetics, epistemology, and metaphysics. So in the span of 10 minutes, how could I possibly summarize the thought of such a wide-ranging and erudite thinker? This is indeed a daunting task to which I will scarcely do it justice. Nevertheless, I have chosen to use these next few moments to speak on his theory of the imagination, or his theory regarding the truthfulness of the imagination. So why? For two reasons. One, because it's a main theme that continually reoccurs throughout his work. And two, it helps us to underscore the profundity of his thought. But to do so, I will need to say a few things about his philosophy or metaphysic. Yes, I realize that 99.9% of the world finds this subject entirely boring and irrelevant. But if you would be so kind as to humor me for the next few moments and bear my penchant for metaphysics, I'll then get to Barfield's theory of the imagination, and lastly, mention some of its theological implications, because of course I'm representing the Divinity School. It's my job. So what is the imagination? Well, today, as a good materialist we all are, as we discussed, and Lewis was, when one hears the word, we often think of a fickle poet or hipster musician who has lost touch with reality. The key word here being the real in reality. See, we're already doing metaphysics. So what one thinks of the imagination depends a lot upon what one takes to be real and that which one takes to be unreal. So what's someone's metaphysic? What's real? What isn't? Okay, one of Owen Barfield's largest issues with modern philosophy in Lewis, in this exchange, you can see this in this great war, is one that's still very much with us today, is its revision of what it takes to be the real, in a sense. And this comes to us, among others, from the philosopher René Descartes, whom relegates everything that is not material to our minds, okay? So hence, the mind, or the subjective realm, in modernity is cut off or separate from the material objective realm. As Barfield sees it, and he is not alone in this, over time, the objective realm is understood as increasingly rational, and the subjective realm irrational, or at the very least, relative. As things progress, the latter becomes increasingly unreal and the former more real. By the time of David Hume, this is stretched further, and today it is degenerated into the ontological naturalism of the new atheists. Like you see these books of Richard Dawkins and God Delusion, where only matter is real anymore. So whereas, at least for Descartes, those things that lie beyond the material are relegated to the mind, in the new atheist schema, there is no mind. Go figure. Only a physical brain. Needless to say, this should horrify us Christians or anyone who values things that transcend or uphold the material or visible realm. Things such as beauty, truth, goodness, love, relationships, morals, persons, God. For Barfield and for almost everyone else, it was these things that were more real, more important than the physical stuff. Thus, for Barfield, the mind was not cut off. It instead corresponds or participates with these real realities in the world. So when we say something is beautiful, it's because it actually is beautiful. Our mind is simply recognizing or corresponding with this truth. And this is why, in a sense, we can be sure of things. So Barfield was well aware that once the mind was sundered from the deeper realities of the world, that relativism would supervene. As he writes, quote, "When the real is taken as unreal, and the unreal is real, the road is open to the madhouse," end quote. This is why so much of Barfield's work is riddled with bold critiques of this Cartesian legacy, which he argued has hijacked modern philosophy, linguistics, social and physical sciences. So most of his work is critiquing this sort of idea that the mind is just this thing, that things beyond material exist just merely in the mind. Fortunately for us, the world moved beyond this 18th century logic, for it was David Hume, whom Kant says had awakened him from his dogmatic slumber. Kant's genius was to reinstate these things that we might say are non-material. He argued that the mind must have pre-given categories by which it places or identifies things in the world. Otherwise, all we would see is material, having no ability to distinguish one thing from the other. I'll spare us all the details in the debate surrounding Kant and run the risk of grossly oversimplifying his philosophy by simply saying that for Kant, these categories are abstract. So what we have in Kant is a very advanced philosophy that is still, according to Barfield, Cartesian. That is, that mind and matter are still separate. So to Barfield, nothing has really changed here. So he is quick to remind us that, as with Descartes, the Kantian legacy is still very much with us. He writes, quote, "So ubiquitous is the Königsberg ghost," he's referring to Kant, "that it is, in my opinion, wise to assume every modern writer on every subject to be guilty of logomorphism." This is a word that Barfield uses all the time. And this is meaning we read our own sort of ideology into the past, which we're reading Kant into everything he's saying, unless someone has actually produced some evidence of their innocence, end quote. So you ask, what does all this philosophical jargon have to do with the imagination? Well, following this logic, Kant, in his third critique, he wrote the Critique of Pure Reason, relegates the imagination to what he calls the sublime, which means it has no meaning or truthfulness to it. So while other abstract categories such as maths, notice I said that plurally because we have a British person or two in our presence, or maybe more, are employed by pure reasoning, this is not so with things seen through the imagination. The imagination for Kant crosses the limits of pure reason. Barfield takes issue with this because he is convinced that the imagination leads to higher truths than Kant's philosophy here affords. So Barfield's theory of the imagination comes through his own scrupulous reading of the English Romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So Barfield should be read as continuing Coleridge's legacy. This work, or his work, can be seen as an attempt to complete this metaphysical picture of the imagination that Coleridge left unfinished in his own Biographia Literaria. Unlike Kant, who demotes the imagination by sundering it from the understanding, Barfield follows Coleridge's off-cited Wordsworthian phrase. He says that the imagination is reason in her most exalted mood. It is in this way that Barfield's work seeks to articulate the truthfulness of the imagination. To my mind, Barfield's most profound argument for the truthfulness of the imagination is implicit in his theory of language, which Dr. Elam mentioned, which he formed very early on his academic career while studying philology, which is sort of the history of word meanings and how that changes over time. In his earliest works, Poetic Diction in History in English Words, Barfield seeks to overturn the predominant theory regarding the evolutionary history of words. It was thought that words started as literal roots. This is called a representational epistemology, which represented objects. So these roots represented objects, and later subjective expressions were then added to the aesthetic encounter, giving us what we now call metaphor. But Barfield accused these theorists of reading the Cartesian legacy into this past, in a sense dividing subject from object. So we encounter an object, we say what it is, and then we give it this aesthetic expression afterwards. So instead, Barfield argues what actually occurs is quite the opposite, and this is the influence he has on Tolkien that we see in the Flagler work that you've mentioned. Indeed, his studies reveal that word meanings actually contract, that's a word that he uses, over time. They begin as metaphorical expressions and eventually become mere nouns or objects. As we might say, a dead metaphor becomes a cliche. For Barfield, the poetic expression is primary because it holds in tension the subjective and objective realms, which together contain the most truth. This primordial aesthetic encounter, which evokes a sense of wonder, reveals to us the mysterious depths of being that are lost only after reason is employed and the imagination is sundered from reason, so to speak. Analogous to the contraction of word meanings, the enlightened scientific world for Barfield has lost touch with the primordial depths of being because it's abstracted this subjective realm and places it only in the mind, so to speak. So Barfield saw the Romantics in England and their use of the imagination as an attempt to revive this vision of the real. For him, the Romantics were not simply projecting some flippant subjective imagination into the world like our hipster or musician I talked about earlier, but rather opening our eyes to the depths of being on which modern philosophy had lost its grip. Again, for the Romantics and for Barfield, when the mind sees beauty, truth, and goodness, it's because they're actually there in the world, a world to which our minds simply correspond or participate. For Barfield, the imagination then acted as a sort of mediator into the infinite depths of being on which Kant's philosophy had placed limits. I'm almost done. Later on in his Speaker's Meaning, we see the maturation of this theory. Therein, Barfield examines the nature of inspiration. How are we inspired to sort of do things? And so in the modern disenchanted world, he says, it is up to the poet or subject now to at once affirm and instill meaning into an otherwise prosaic or objective world. Prosaic is a word he uses when something becomes dead. He paints for us a picture of a poet who, by suspending both subject and object, reaches beyond this Kantian threshold, which he calls, not into a sublime nothingness as with postmodernity, but rather into the infinite depths of being, allowing us to once again wonder at the mystery of being. So in closing, I would like to speak theologically for a moment and stretch this a bit beyond Barfield. From a purely philosophical perspective, human knowing will always encounter an ontological ceiling, like an end to where it says, okay, we can only know this much. So such pure reason places limits on what we can know. It forces an ontological paradigm, a paradigm of what we think the limits of what are real, upon being or upon the world, rather than allowing the aesthetic encounter to speak for itself. We might here follow Hegel and ask, how can one place such limits without first having already exceeded them? So this is what Hegel's critique of Kant is. How do you know the limits if you don't already have exceeded them? So from a theological perspective, it is this setting of limits that hinders us from expressing the true nature of things as God made them. What I want to suggest is that what we can glean from Barfield's work on the imagination is an aesthetic by which to view human creativity in relation to God. And this is what we're all after here. It may sound odd to afford the human a unique role in affirming the actual being of the world as Barfield is doing here in his work, but this is precisely what is happening in the Genesis narrative wherein man names the creatures. In Genesis 2:19, we see God graciously lending man a share in identifying or naming things. So, in other words, we're seeing man play this role in identifying the reality of the purposes of things in the naming of the creature. So, If the Spirit is still speaking, then as Barfield's theory reminds us, this process is never complete. And this is the irony that lies behind the enlightened attempt to combine a purified reason with this notion of progress. As against Hegel, Kierkegaard reminds us that such a system affords us no motion or progress at all, only commotion. Instead, if we follow Barfield's theory of the imagination, it is our task as Christians to maintain a sense of wonder, allowing space for rupture and surprise in our encounter with the world. This is the true Christian vision of a never-ending pilgrimage towards God that is both reasonable and faithful, as we say here at Regent. So I now have the honor of introducing you to our guest. But before I did so, I wanted to share really briefly, because I haven't shared this with Owen yet, how we met, because I think it's pretty funny. And Owen doesn't know this, is what I just said. I was in the north of England 2 or 3 years ago at the time, writing my dissertation on Owen Barfield. And I'm buried in books on Owen Barfield, thinking I must be the only person in the world that's reading this. And as any good academic does, I went on Facebook just to break up my work. And I look and I noticed that there was a friend request from Owen Barfield. And you can imagine the hair on my arms stood up. And I'm sort of looking around going, does he click, you know? And then I'm like, okay, this is his grandson. But anyway, that was my first interaction with him. And then he came along last summer to Oxford to a conference we were doing on the soul there, and it was just great to meet him. And so it is my pleasure to introduce to you Owen Barfield, the grandson of the man we've all been talking about here. So Owen, welcome.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for your talk. That Facebook comment of yours just shows how desperate I am to have friends. I happen to find myself here on a holiday vacation for 2 weeks, and it's pure coincidence that Michael was here and that we could get this event together. I've got to say, in all sincerity, this is the highlight of my holiday. You know, this is really the best part of it. And so I really want to thank everybody here at the university, especially the organizers, because I can see a lot of effort's gone into it. It's a lovely display at the front of the library, a beautiful setup. The staff for allowing Michael to do it, and particularly for Michael for making all the arrangements. That's absolutely great. But most of all, I want to thank the audience for being here, because that's what it's all about. So I really appreciate you being here. And I want to say that that not only has merit in itself, but it puts you ahead of the crowd. So grandfather had friends who were called Inklings. His first friend was Cecil Harwood, who he met at Highgate School, same school I went to, actually. And that was his first friend, who agreed with him and they thought alike. Cecil Harwood then went on to found the Anthroposophic Society of Great Britain, which started the first Rudolf Steiner Waldorf schools in the English-speaking world, and there's a whole network now of about 1,000 schools. All that started with Cecil Harwood, grandfather's first friend. Those two met C.S. Lewis in their first term of the first year at Oxford University, and Lewis became grandfather's second friend, the friend that he could have as a counterweight, a debate, as was hinted at in the first talk, and thanks for bringing that up. So you have these two men. And I think there was a sort of understanding between Lewis and grandfather that they were writing for different audiences, because everybody said, well, why is Lewis so well known and grandfather's not known at all? And yet they were equals and peers and everything. And you know, that's a hard one for me to answer, but I can say that Lewis was writing very much for his audience at that time, which was Britain in the war years, 1940s, 1950s. He had to reach out, he had a certain message to give. I think grandfather also felt as an author that he too had a message to give, but his message wasn't going to be received by that community in that period of time, Britain in the 1940s. I think grandfather was always very pleasantly surprised that in America he was much better understood, much more warmly received, and grandfather always veered towards America, veered towards a sort of a future writing, if you like. So if I was going to sort of very succinctly put that in my own words, I was saying that Lewis was writing for a contemporary audience then, and grandfather was writing for a future audience to come. And Lewis is almost a signpost to grandfather. If you don't understand what Lewis is trying to tell you, then you're just not going to understand what grandfather is telling you for the future. But if you can get as far as Lewis, then have a go at going a little bit further and seeing what grandfather is telling you. Because grandfather thought he would be understood round about 2030, 2040. That's a time when people would start to understand what he was saying. He actually gave that timescale. Now, grandfather died in 1997. 9 years later, I was appointed one of his trustees. So he had 4 trustees, one of which was Walter Hooper. I mentioned that name because it might be a name that some people recognize, Walter Hooper. Walter Hooper stepped down from being grandfather's trustee, and I took his place. I was appointed by Walter Hooper. It's curious how these things go around, because Walter Hooper himself was appointed trustee by grandfather to be trustee of Lewis's estate. So originally, Lewis had appointed Cecil Harwood and Owen Barfield, those 3 friends again. So Lewis had appointed those 2. Cecil died, grandfather was getting old, and he wanted somebody younger, so he appointed Walter Hooper. Walter Hooper then went off and built that career, as it were, but was charged with grandfather's material as well until he resigned from that point, which is when I picked up in 2006, 9 years after grandfather died. Since then, the other trustees have also resigned, so I've been left to carry that myself. And what I've done is I've made public grandfather's archive in Bodleian Library. So you can refer to all the papers that are in his archive through the Bodleian Library's website, much of which is unpublished, and almost all of it is unlooked at. What I've also done is published 15 of grandfather's books. And I noticed as I was doing that C.S. Lewis is referred to in one way or another in about half of them. He's either a character in one book, or referred to, or a reference. They're ever so subtle, but it is curious that at least half his published books have got Lewis in them somewhere or other. And I'm just going to talk about one of the 15, and the one I'm picking up is Night Operation, because it's very short, very easy to read, and it's science fiction. So grandfather wrote 3 fictional novellas which have been published, one of which is Night Operation. And in this book, Night Operation, there are 3 characters. One is called John, as in St. John, John's Gospel, and that represents grandfather, the, if you like, prophet. The other one is called Pete, as in St. Peter, the rock, and that one represents Cecil Harwood. And the third character is Jack, as in Jack Lewis, and he represents us all, every man, Jack. So the interaction of these 3 characters in the book very much represents the friendship of these 3 and how they go about addressing what they have to deal with in that science fiction scenario. I just want to finish on a couple of sentences. One, in your talk, you referred to the subject as being boring. I want to say it's not boring. That's very important. In fact, grandfather's own words is that what he's dealing with here is essential for the survival of humanity. So we can't make it any clearer than that. The task and the question is how to address it, how to make it relevant, and how to sort of bring that down and make that real. And that's what I leave open to yourselves at this university and other places like this. It's a task of scholars, academics, to get a hold of this and to try and make it real and try and explain it to the wider community. But in grandfather's view, the survival of humanity depends on its ability to understand this and where it's going with this. And the other thing I'd like to just end on is it's an open field. In terms of researchers and PhDs and everything that's going on in the academic world, please encourage people to look at this. There's a huge opportunity. Much of it's untouched. Michael could sort of testify. He's had a glimpse at what's there. I'm sure he's the first to say that there's a lot more to be done. And with that, I'll conclude. Thanks.
Thanks, Owen. I'm going to facilitate a time of Q&A. And of course, at the moderator, I get the privilege to ask the first question. Just a few comments. you know, many of you know Dr. Fraser and I have been going over to Oxford for the last 8 years to teach a class on C.S. Lewis, and that's how we personally were introduced to Owen's grandfather. And one of the things that's most impressive to me isn't just his great intellectual ability, but it's the kind of person that he was, and I'm going to ask Owen about that. One of the reasons he wasn't able to give himself fully just to academics like Lewis was is because Owen's great-grandfather had a law practice, and he needed help, and he asked his grandfather to help him in that practice. And so he spent many, many hours doing that, in which, you know, he was just doing everyday business of law, in which takes a lot of time out of your schedule. And so he didn't have as much time to write during that time that he was involved in the law practice. The second thing is his servant heart, because one of the things he did in the law practice is he gave away Lewis's money. Lewis gave away probably about half of his money. And Owen's grandfather really helped facilitate a lot of his personal finances and giving away the money and so forth. So, and then the third thing is, some of you heard that term causal stripe, which is thinking as you're walking and walking about. And every year, several of the Inklings got together and went on these long walks together. And the rule was you could intellectually debate things of importance up until lunchtime. And then after lunchtime, you can only talk about frivolous things after lunch. And Owen's grandfather was on many of those walks. And I think they grew really close. And I was reading beforehand one of Walter Hooper's interviews with Owen's grandfather about what he missed in Lewis the most, and that was their ability to intellectually challenge one another. As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. And I think that's why both Lewis and Owen's grandfather valued their friendship and their relationship so much. So my question, Owen, what is your favorite story about your grandfather that tells us more about what kind of person he was like?
Oh, right, okay. I should have asked for an advance list of questions. Okay, my favorite question. I'm just going to reflect what you were saying. So, grandfather was a lawyer. He didn't want to be a lawyer. Yeah, financial circumstances forced him in that direction. He was Lewis's lawyer, and Lewis was notoriously poor at administration, to the extent that the tax man was taking away, you know, all the royalties that he was getting because of the tax system at the time in England. So grandfather had to draw his attention to this, restructure his finances, and therefore they had this charitable fund which they set up together with, I think it's called the Agape Fund, and grandfather would just administer that. My own recollections of grandfather was somebody who just knew the names of things. So, for example, I'd go on a Sunday, we'd have tea and maybe a walk in the countryside, and he would just be able to name everything, you know, birds flying, plants. He just knew, he just knew everything. And this is a man who's sort of in his mid-80s by that stage, you know, just a man who had a name, who just knew how to name things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you were talking about how he's drawn to the U.S. I think he had at least 6 appointments to universities in the U.S.
Yes.
Yeah.
They are listed, so the formal appointments are all listed, and that's about that kind of number. Each one being about 9 months or a year, so there's quite long chunks of time. But then he also did a lot of informal talking, so that was, I mean, he spent a lot of time. He really lived his life in 3 thirds. So the first third, he was a poet, author. And during that third, which takes you up to the age of about 33, a sort of significant age, he was really financed by his wife, Maud, who was independently wealthy. So he was able to be this poet-author up until this really quite late age, thanks to Maud. the second third is when he was that professional man, the lawyer, if you like. There are advantages sometimes of coming out of academia. You might not believe it, but being in the real world, also changes your perspective. And you could say it might have helped him or made his work, different and made it more real, I think. He was trying to say this isn't just for academics to knock about or Inklings in the pub. This is for everybody. So I think him being in the real world, although he almost had a sort of a nervous breakdown, which led to one of his books, This Ever Diverse Pair, also gave him a sort of, planted his feet firmly on the ground. And then that third phase when he was the professor, and that was his best phase, and he was a professor here in America, and he is so, thankful to America for supporting him and bringing him in. So, that is definitely his earliest phase, happiest phase of life, like that last phase, which is unusual. Most people, by the time they're old, are kind of embittered, but not him. He was just like a boy, in his old age. Very curious.
Okay, questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you for spending part of your vacation with us. I'd like you to comment on two things. Could you describe your grandfather's formal education? I gather he had a law background. And then also, what were his non-academic reading interests?
Well, his formal education was very ordinary in some ways. An English public school, Highgate in North London, where they studied classics. And it was in that school where he had his first Inkling moment. So it was when his friend Cecil Harwood sat next to him, was translating a piece of Latin. The literal translation for the text was to walk out of death, meaning, it meant death, but the literal translation was to walk out of life. So when grandfather heard this vocalized by his friend Cecil, he had a kind of revelation that language held meaning. And he was only a schoolboy when that happened. Then he served in the First World War, and that was, if you like, a university of life. He came across people from all over the world, all walks of life. There are letters with him commenting on the American soldiers that come over to serve in that army. And so it was his first exposure to the world. But he was very lucky. He only arrived at the front the day after the armistice came. There was a sort of mysterious hand of fate that held him back and held him safe. So he never actually got to the front. And when he did, everybody else, just the day after, the week after the armistice, so busy being busy and fussing about, nobody touched him. So he spent his whole time reading books, riding horses, learning French. He had a lovely war. So,
Wonderful war.
yeah. And he had all this gear, that he could just use. So, that was a lovely experience for him. And then he went to university, which he was lucky enough to get into. Yeah. And then he was very much self-taught, because his thesis at university, which became poetic diction, was beyond the ability of the supervisors at the university. They weren't able to guide him. He was just left alone to write poetic diction. And he then realized that university was not the place for him. It's not where he was going to develop it. One, it had a very kind of closed mentality, and two, they just academically weren't working at his level, really. So that's why he was so grateful to find friends like Lewis, who he could at least have a conversation with.
Other questions?
Sorry, there was a second part to the question, is
Yeah.
reading material. That's a short answer, because the other one was a long answer.
Yeah.
Agatha Christie.
First of all, thank you for coming. And my question is, my understanding there were 3 children in terms of your genealogy. There was Alexander, Lucy, and Jeffrey, and Lucy having Lion Witch in the Wardrobe dedicated to her, and Jeffrey Voyage. Tim, I was just curious, who was your father, or who your parents were?
So it's Alexander's my dad, and he's the oldest child. So I'm guessing he was already quite old before the Lion, the Witch, and the Narnia books were written. That's probably why he's not covered there. So that I'm the only grandchild. So of all those 3, I'm the only child. And Lucy had multiple sclerosis and died in 2003. And Jeffrey's still alive, but quite elderly, and he lives a very quiet life. I see him Christmas and correspond. Jeffrey was fostered, and there's a story there about characters. Jeffrey was a war child, and Maud, because there was a general call to support children who needed families, Maud brought in this war baby. And she kept him as was expected during the war. And then the idea was that the babies are meant to go back to their mothers once the war's over. But the mother didn't really want Jeffrey, and so they were a bit stuck. And grandfather said, oh, he's got 2 children already, doesn't want any more, you know, a lot of hassle and stuff like that. But C.S. Lewis came in and argued the case for Jeffrey and convinced grandfather, you know, to keep Jeffrey. So there is this kind of constant ebbing and flowing between them. And I mention Maud because she's an important part of that whole setup. It was Maud that sort of almost mentored Lewis in the very early years. So she married grandfather, but she mentored Lewis. And she was 14 years older than grandfather. So she's a very important person.
Mm-hmm.
I also thank you for coming. 2 questions. First, what was so compelling about Rudolf Steiner's ideas that attracted your father? And second, both Lewis and Tolkien were very mischievous in placing each other into their fiction. Was your father ever placed into either one of their works in an incognito way?
I'll answer the second one first. As far as I'm aware, I'm not a Lewis expert, but is there a book called Pilgrim's something? Progress. Progress.
Pilgrim's Regress.
In there, is there a John character or John Pilgrim? So that John Pilgrim is probably the closest he gets to modelling grandfather. So that's that question. The other question is, what appealed to him to Rudolf Steiner? Well, quite frankly, grandfather had studied the theme, as it were, and had independently got to where Steiner was. So he had sort of independently came to the same conclusions and was baffled by the fact that Steiner had got there not only before him, but to a greater depth and with more vision. So that is really why he then kind of said, well, there's no point in me reinventing all this. You know, Steiner's got there before me and says it, okay, although he doesn't say it very clearly, and it's all very Germanic and difficult to understand. Steiner has laid it down, but grandfather had done enough of his own work to get to the position where he recognized the validity in what Steiner was saying. I think that's as much as I can say on that.
What was your second one, Terry? Second question?
It was the character.
Okay.
Which were the universities in America where your grandfather taught?
Well, one was Drew, one was, is it Hamilton. Those 2 gave him honorary degrees, so honoris causa, which is why they come to my mind. He's got 2 honoris causa from those 2 universities. And then there's a whole swathe, particularly Toronto, Vancouver, California.
Yeah. Cal State Fullerton, I think he was there.
Montreal, but that might have just been a guest appearance. The list is on the front page of the website. Yeah.
Okay. One more question? Yes?
Can you speak more about what your grandfather meant by the imagination, and just a little bit more about why it is so vital?
Yeah. I might have to hand that one over to Michael, but before I do so, let me just give you a phrase that comes to mind. So grandfather's trying to answer that himself. So what I would say is that grandfather felt that imagination was a route to truth. So he got to truth through imagination. And grandfather said that's a valid route to take. Whereas I think Lewis would just value imagination for what it was. He wasn't necessarily trying to uncover truth through imagination. That's my understanding of it. But grandfather puts it like this, that Lewis saw imagination as a beautiful lady that he put on a pedestal and, if you like, worshipped. Whereas grandfather saw imagination as that beautiful lady who he wanted to marry.
Well, the library and the School of Divinity. I want to thank all of our presenters. I'm Mitch Land, the Dean of the School of Communication and the Arts. What a privilege to get to discover Barfield. And by so discovering, we get a better picture of C.S. Lewis. But what a wonderful opportunity to research, and a whole field could open up. I wish we had time for more questions, but maybe at the reception after, we hope you all stay and ask those questions. So I want to thank Dr. Barron for helping to organize this, absolutely, and Micahel Elam for your wonderful remarks, Dr. DiFuccia as well, thank you, and certainly Owen Barfield, thank you so much for your participation and especially sharing your vacation with us at Regent. And of course, my wonderful colleague that I admire greatly, Dr. Bill Brown, Professor, Research Fellow, Department Chair at the School of Communication and the Arts. And thank you for your remarks, Bill, that were very valuable to us. So I'd like for us to just have a word of prayer, close in a word of prayer, just thanking God for all of this wonderful opportunity we have and the good refreshments, scones, and tea. I don't know if it rises to the level of high tea, but at least it approaches that level. So let's thank God. Thank you, Father, for the wonderful lives of Barfield and Lewis and so many others, Hooper and others. Thank you, Lord, for Tolkien. Thank you for the literature that they've left us and the gold mine of literature that we can discover from Barfield. We thank you so much for Owen Barfield and Owen Barfield III. We thank you for them. In Jesus' name, we thank you for good food, fellowship, and this valuable day. Amen.